discussed it other than I tell him what's in the news about it.
And what's his reaction? What does he say?
Go tell him that I need a pardon. Go tell him I deserve a pardon. That's what he said.
That's Diddy's lead defense attorney giving the exclusive to CBS Mornings. And get this, while Diddy faces a possible 20-year sentence, is he still planning a music comeback?
He said, well, he's going to be back in Madison Square Garden.
Doing what?
I guess being on stage, you know? I mean, and I said, I'll be there.
Diddy's world has officially collapsed. After months of speculation, high-profile lawsuits, federal raids, and damning accusations, the moment finally came. The courtroom was silent, the cameras were off, and the weight of years of secrets hung in the air like smoke. And then the judge spoke. What followed wasn't just a sentence, it was a dismantling.
A pardon, meaning Diddy, let's say he gets 5 years in prison, Trump pardons him, he's free to go? President Trump was asked about this a few months ago before the verdict. This was back in May. And he said when asked about a pardon for Diddy, I would certainly look at the facts. If I think somebody was mistreated, whether they like me or don't like me, it wouldn't have any impact on me. He used to really like me a lot, but I think when I ran for politics, that relationship busted up from what I read. I don't know, he didn't tell me that, but I'd read some little bit nasty statements in the paper all of a sudden. And Diddy had been photographed with Trump over the years. There was some sort of relationship there. President Trump even called him a good friend on a 2012 episode of his TV show, The Apprentice. The problem is, some comments Diddy made about Trump in recent years as Diddy really entered the political realm. There's a video where he's speaking to radio host Charlemagne saying, if Trump gets elected, I really do believe in my heart there'll be a race war. In another video on Revolt, he says white men like Trump need to be banished. And by the way, you know who's not letting anyone forget this? Combs' rival 50 Cent. Took to social media recently, wrote, see, Trump don't like S like this, buddy. You run your mouth too much. And Donald doesn't take well to disrespect and doesn't forget who chooses to go against him. While working tirelessly to make America great again, there is no room for distraction. He would consider pardoning anyone who was being mistreated, not Puff Daddy. And let me tell you, the idea of Trump pardoning Diddy is not getting a ton of love out there. Conservative commentator Megyn Kelly posted on X, Trump should not pardon Diddy. He doesn't deserve it. He's a Trump hater. He's a woman abuser. MAGA is already upset over elites seeming to cover for each other. This would not help. GOP struggling with young female voters, most of whom will hate a Diddy pardon. And then you just had other random accounts like America First. What? He's actually considering this? Diddy is a depraved, abusive, sexual deviant who should be spending the rest of his life in prison. If Trump pardons him, he will get absolutely crushed. Who is advising him lately? It's looking like straight up sabotage at this point. There were other accounts that were not in favor of it, although there was this account. Milo posted on X, Trump has no choice but to pardon Diddy after the government, led by James Comey's daughter Maureen, simply lost interest in Diddy's guilt the moment they secured his tapes incriminating powerful Democrats. The prosecution was a shambles. The trial was a farce. Now, I want to talk about if this is really going to happen, how it would happen. Also, if it really depends on bail and sentencing, then what are we talking about? And I have somebody who not only has been following the Diddy case from the very beginning, not only is a renowned criminal defense attorney, but actually has obtained federal pardons from the president, including from Donald Trump. By the way, for his clients Kodak Black and Lil Wayne, those were maybe the most notable. I'm joined by Bradford Cohen. Bradford, thank you so much for coming here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
Now, before I even get into the pardon, okay, there was a bit of breaking news before we were going to come on. This is what I want to get your opinion on first. So Combs' defense team filed a memo in support of a motion for judgment of acquittal, or in the alternative, a motion for a new trial. And basically, I know you read through it, but basically the evidence, they would say, is insufficient to sustain that conviction. Their main arguments is really echoing what we've talked about a little bit when it came to the bail analysis, but that his prosecution, his conviction on these Mann Act prostitution charges is so unique. He wasn't profiting off of this business. All consenting adults were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking. They argued this isn't even prostitution per se, it's voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but he paid them for their time. Everybody was having a good time. He makes a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were typically videotaped so they could watch them later on. It's just amateur pornography. And then finally makes the argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, and would have never came in if he was merely being prosecuted for prostitution, particularly the Intercontinental Hotel footage of him purporting to beat up Cassie Ventura Fine. And he says, at the very least, he needs a new trial. I hand it over to you. You think this?
A complete breakdown of everything Sean Diddy Combs built, piece by piece, reputation, power, influence obliterated, and the kicker? It all unraveled in one brutal moment, right after the judge revealed details that were so disturbing. Even the courtroom was shaken. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This wasn't some performative punishment meant to save face. This was Judgment Day, a prison sentence that will likely redefine the legacy of one of hip-hop's most iconic, and now disgraced, figures. But let's not pretend this came out of nowhere. No, this was a storm years in the making. For decades, Diddy stood at the top of the mountain, not just in music, but in fashion, spirits, television, tech, you name it. He was a brand, a mogul, a cultural architect. The name Diddy carried weight, respect, fear, influence. He was everywhere, and he had everyone in his orbit, from global pop stars to political figures to Wall Street investors. He wasn't just part of the game, he helped write the rules. But behind the scenes?
This is a successful argument.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if it's going to be successful in the judgment of acquittal. I think the argument is interesting because everyone agrees he might be the only person in custody right now that has ever been convicted of the Mann Act. The Mann Act, and it gives a nice history of the Mann Act, and a lot of people don't understand what the Mann Act is, but the Mann Act was enacted because of a racist motivation that white women were being recruited by people of color to go across state lines and make money. So actually pimping those women across state lines and making money off of their sexual exploits. Obviously, that's not the case here. It's used so infrequently, it might have been a handful of people were actually charged with the Mann Act. No one in custody currently has ever been convicted of the Mann Act. So it's an interesting argument to say, hey, listen, this Mann Act, the original reason for it was racist. The original way that it was applied was racist. The way it's applied here is incorrect because he was not making any money from quote unquote pimping or getting these women across or men getting them across state lines. None of that was being done. This was all being done for entertainment purposes. So it's an interesting argument. I don't think this judge buys it. It might be interesting on an appeal, but I don't think the judge is going to give him a judgment of acquittal on those two counts based on the argument. Now, the more interesting argument to me, and it's their last argument for new trial, is that, listen, if you were just going to charge him with these two counts, which I originally said when I looked at all the evidence, and don't forget, I was getting calls during this trial from individuals that were telling me, hey, I have information that exonerates what they're saying against Sean Combs, essentially saying that Cassie and others were participating more than just having sex in a room. They were participating more than that. They were paying people. They were hiring people. They were sending me pictures even when Diddy wasn't around. They were asking me to come over even when Diddy wasn't around. These are what these witnesses were telling me, which is really Brady evidence. And I don't know if that was ever turned over. But the more interesting argument is that all these counts were charged. The only thing he was convicted of were the Mann Acts. And he probably wouldn't have been convicted of these Mann Acts, but for all this other stuff that came in to try and prove these counts that they could not prove and did not have a basis for bringing.
Let me just challenge you on that, because this is a jury who didn't find that there was sex trafficking. And I can't confirm that they found him guilty of the Mann Act because of the hotel video or anything else. I mean, it seems to me that they might have convicted him on that based on the travel records, the payment receipts, all about that. Not even necessarily allegations of violence. I mean, do you think that it was because of, let's say, the Intercontinental Hotel video that he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution? It always felt to me that they proved that charge based purely on, the documents.
Well, I always feel like during a trial, whenever you get a guilty verdict on one of the counts or two of the counts out of 6 or 7, you think to yourself, is it because of these other things that they brought up? How bad he is, he's not a good guy, the video came out. Sometimes juries will split the baby, meaning, there's people that want to convict, there's people that don't want to convict, and they're like, okay, let's convict him on these acts. We can all agree we can convict him on these acts. He's not a good guy. He transported these men across state lines. Let's convict him on this. There's always going to be a question of that. The only way to not have a question of that, obviously, is when the jury.
There were whispers. Always whispers. Stories that never quite made it to the headlines. Rumors of parties that weren't really parties. Contracts that didn't feel like choices. People disappearing from the industry without warning. And Diddy? Always standing just outside the blast radius. Clean, untouchable, surrounded by handlers, lawyers, and silence. Until now. Because the silence broke. The lawsuits started rolling in, one after the other. Allegations ranging from coercion to trafficking to manipulation so dark, so twisted, it made people question everything they thought they knew about the man who once danced in shiny suits and dropped platinum albums. At first, it seemed like just another celebrity scandal, another fall from grace in a long list of rich and powerful men finally being held accountable. But then the Feds showed up. Homeland Security, federal agents raiding his homes in Los Angeles and Miami, helicopters, SWAT, warrants, property seized.
Your inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls, that was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago, but how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I mean, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, I mean, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just, maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have
devices taken. And suddenly, this wasn't about the music anymore. This wasn't about fame, or image, or brand deals. This was criminal. This was serious. This was federal. And through all of it, Diddy stayed quiet. He issued a few vague denials through his lawyers, posted a few Instagram clips, but otherwise, nothing, no interviews, no apologies, no explanations. He went ghost. And the silence only made it worse, because the public? We've seen this movie before, and we know what silence usually means. But no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what came next. The trial. Because as soon as the courtroom doors opened, it wasn't just Diddy on trial, It was the entire world he had created, the lifestyle, the secrecy, the image, and for the first time, we saw behind the curtain, and what we saw was horrific. Victims came forward. Not anonymous statements, not blog posts, real people, speaking under oath, breaking NDAs, putting their names, their faces, and their trauma on the line, and their stories matched, too closely, too precisely. They spoke of being invited to exclusive parties, only to realize they weren't parties at all. They were traps, controlled environments, isolated locations where phones were confiscated, security was tight, and the only rule was, what happens here, stays here. They described surveillance, emotional manipulation, coercion disguised as opportunity, contracts signed under pressure, escapes attempted and shut down, and Diddy, always in the center, never getting his hands dirty, but always pulling the strings. And then came the evidence. Texts, emails, surveillance footage, bank transfers, flight logs, security records.
Jury comes out, someone gives an interview and says, hey, this is why we did it, is because, this tape was so bad and these other incidents were so bad that we were like, we can't just let him walk with nothing. So we convicted him on the Mann Acts. Now, we don't have a juror saying that. Do I think eventually jurors are going to start coming out? Yeah, I think so. I think some of these jurors are going to come out. They're going to want to do some interviews, not before sentencing. And I think after sentencing, I think some of them will come out and we'll discuss it, because I think that was the feeling I was getting from this jury and the reactions they had to Comey's closing, and even the reaction just in general to the 5 or the 6 U.S. attorney team. I think their reactions in general were very noticeable, and I think that this is a jury that wants to talk to people once I think he gets sentenced.
Okay, so now let's move on to the pardon discussion. So if he can't get relief from the court in getting the conviction thrown out or a new trial, can he get relief through a pardon? Before we talk about, is this a real thing, what is the process to even obtain a federal pardon? How do you even go about that?
Sure. So it's a pardon or a commutation. If someone is actually in custody, they could also get a commutation, which does not wipe the crime off your record. It just allows you to get out of jail. So he has that option to give him a commutation. If he gets sentenced, he can also give him a commutation. But as for the process, there's an application on the DOJ website, and I'm part of some charities that also do a lot of pro bono work for pardons and commutations. You can fill out this form, DOJ website. It essentially lists the reasons why you should get a pardon, what kind of community service you've done, things of that nature. There's a separate application for a commutation, but you can file a pardon application, and you could also say, hey, listen, if it's not a pardon, I'm looking for a commutation. You attach your indictment, you would reasons why you feel your crime was you were unfairly prejudiced or unfairly convicted. All of those things go into the packet. I always try to help people that are filling it out on their own to show them, what to point out. Those type of cases are always heartening, because those people deserve pardons. They deserve commutations if they're in, and it's some sort of crazy drug offense that was brought up in the 90s. All of those things are reasons for pardons and commutations.
So is this real? I mean, here's the thing. He is in a much better position to get a pardon or a commutation of his sentence because he wasn't convicted of sex trafficking and racketeering. There is a way to justify this based on some of the arguments I just mentioned that his defense team is making, that maybe he shouldn't have been brought up on this. The Mann Act, not as serious as what he's facing. Is this real? Do you think that this is going to happen, that he's going to get a pardon or a commutation from President Trump?
So I don't know if he's going to get one. I do think that it's real because, like I said before, President Trump, whether they like him, don't like him, if he feels something is wrong, and we've seen this happen before in the past, if he feels something is wrong, someone got railroaded, someone was convicted, wrongfully, he will take a look at that. Yeah, Sean has said things.
The kind of evidence that doesn't just support a story, it confirms it, removes doubt, turns whispers into undeniable truth. And the judge? The judge didn't hold back. Right before announcing the sentence, the judge addressed the court directly, laid it all out: the pattern, the manipulation, the systemic abuse of power, the psychological toll on the victims, the years it took for them to find their voices, the power structure that kept them silent, and most importantly, the role Diddy played in maintaining that system. What the judge said was chilling. They called Diddy a calculated architect of exploitation, not a man who made a few bad choices, but a man who designed an ecosystem where exploitation wasn't the exception, it was the rule. A system built on secrecy, intimidation, and fear, and in the judge's own words, every layer of your empire was built on the silence of others. Then came the sentence. Years, double digits, a devastating blow. And for Diddy, it wasn't just the time, it was the symbolism, the message, that no amount of money, power, or status could protect him anymore, that the truth had finally caught up, that the myth of invincibility was gone. And the moment the gavel hit? It was over. You could feel the shift. This wasn't just a trial, this was the end of an era, the fall of a titan, a collapse that sent shockwaves through every corner of the industry. Because here's the thing, Diddy's fall doesn't stop with Diddy. This trial exposed more than just one man's crimes. It exposed the machinery that allowed it all to happen.
This motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which, so we think we have a really strong motion. And so we're hoping the judge will agree. We'll see.
So just to be clear, I'll list out a couple of things that stood out to me when we were watching the trial. There was apparently this voice message that was played from Combs to Paul, right, one of the purported sex workers. Hit me up when you close. There was a voice message. Hey, Jess, I need to get him from Atlanta to here. Let me know. Hit me up. There was a message from, I think, Combs to Christina Courtroom. Can security bring me 5,000? There was another audio message to Jane. I sent you 15K, baby girl. There was another one to Frank Rodriguez. Frank, make sure that room is set up right. So in other words, you could look at this and say, and the argument is, even despite all that, it's paying people for their time. It's setting up, let's say, amateur pornography. What makes this not?
People who knew, the executives who looked the other way, the artists who stayed silent to protect their careers, the media outlets that chose to report fluff instead of fact, everyone who benefited from his rise, without asking how it was funded. And now? They're next. The judge made it clear, the investigation is ongoing. The case is far from over. More names are being looked into. More testimonies are being collected. More subpoenas are being issued. This was just the first domino. And with Diddy behind bars? There's no one left to protect the rest. The empire is gone. Revolt TV? Collapsing. Ciroc partnerships? Cut. Music catalogs? Devalued. Legacy? Destroyed. the name Diddy no longer represents success, it represents scandal, it represents trauma, it represents what happens when power goes unchecked for too long. And for the public? It's a wake-up call. We've been conditioned to worship success, to idolize wealth, to ignore the red flags if the person waving them is rich enough, famous enough, cool enough. But now, we're being forced to reckon with what that really means, what it really costs, who really pays the price. So what happens now? Diddy serves his time. But the industry keeps burning. Because more victims are speaking up, more lawsuits are coming, more secrets are being uncovered, and every day, the story grows bigger, more tangled, more dangerous. And somewhere in a prison cell, Diddy watches it all fall apart. The fame, the glory, the empire. Gone. Forever. Because in the end, no matter how powerful you are, how untouchable you think you've become, truth has a way of catching up. And when it does, it doesn't knock, it kicks the door in. This is no longer just a scandal. This is a reckoning. And it's only just begun. Stay watching, stay listening, because the next name to fall might be one you never expected.